Kirk to Rayborn, report. I'm required to make a security confirmation. When I call my ship, if you list your personnel, cargo requirements, any special needs.
There are television shows that push boundaries, and then there's Star Trek. For nearly 6 decades, this franchise has done something that very few science fiction properties have ever managed to pull off consistently. It has used the language of the future to talk about the problems of the present. Alien civilizations stand in for real-world nations. Futuristic dilemmas mirror the social tensions of whatever decade the show happens to be airing in. And the crew of whatever starship happens to be on screen at the time represents, at least in Gene Roddenberry's hopeful imagination, the very best version of what humanity could one day become. But here's the thing about a show that is always pushing forward, always testing the limits of what television is willing to show and what audiences are prepared to accept. Sometimes it pushes too far. Sometimes the writer's room produces something so unsettling, so graphically disturbing, or so socially charged that the people responsible for putting it on air simply refuse to do so. Networks pull episodes. Broadcasters in other countries quietly leave certain installments off their schedules. Censors demand cuts that change the entire tone of a story. And in some cases, episodes that originally aired decades ago have still never been shown in certain parts of the world. That is what this video is about. Not the episodes that sparked a little controversy and then faded from memory. We are talking about the stories that were genuinely banned, restricted, edited beyond recognition, or kept from audiences for reasons that, once you understand the context, make complete and obvious sense. These are the Star Trek episodes that went too far, and the reasons why are as fascinating as the episodes themselves. Let us begin with one of the earliest examples of Star Trek causing genuine alarm among broadcasters. And to understand why this episode landed the way it did, you have to place yourself in the television landscape of the late 1960s. The original series was still a relatively new show when it aired an episode in its first season called Miri. On the surface, it begins like dozens of other Star Trek episodes. The Enterprise receives a distress signal. The crew investigates, and they find something strange waiting for them on a distant planet. What makes this one different is where that strangeness leads. The planet the crew discovers is an exact duplicate of Earth, locked in an eerie, decayed version of mid-20th century America. The streets are empty. The buildings are crumbling. There is no sign of adult life anywhere. When a horribly disfigured man lurches out of the shadows and attacks the landing party before collapsing and dying in front of them, it becomes immediately clear that whatever happened here was catastrophic and recent. The explanation, when it comes, is genuinely chilling. Centuries earlier, scientists on this planet developed a life extension experiment that went terribly wrong. The experiment worked in a fashion. Children were left aging at a fraction of normal speed, living for hundreds of years while still possessing the emotional and psychological development of kids. But for anyone who had already reached puberty, the results were horrific. The disease caused violent madness and then death. Every adult on the planet was wiped out, leaving behind hundreds of children who had been slowly aging, 1 month per century, ever since. Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and the rest of the landing party quickly realize they are not just investigating a mystery. They are also infected. The same purple lesions that marked the adults before they went mad are beginning to appear on their own skin. McCoy races to synthesize a cure using the planet's old medical facilities, while the crew attempts to manage a growing mob of children who are terrified and hostile toward any adult, whom they call grups in their corrupted childhood slang for grown-ups. The episode works on multiple levels. On one hand, it is a tense survival story with a ticking biological clock. On the other, it is a genuinely disturbing exploration of what happens to children when they're left entirely without adult guidance for centuries. The kids in the episode are not evil. They're frightened, stunted, and deeply confused. Their ringleader, a boy named John, steals the crew's communicators not out of malice, but out of fear. If the grown-ups find a cure, more adults will come, and the children's isolated world will be disrupted forever. What made the BBC uncomfortable enough to pull this episode after a single airing in 1970 was a combination of factors. The depiction of children as a threatening mob was deeply unsettling to British censors. The graphic death of the disfigured man in the opening scene, combined with the progressive worsening of the disease on the adult characters, created an atmosphere of dread and bodily horror that the network felt was inappropriate for the family viewing slot in which Star Trek was typically broadcast. The episode was left out of repeats for years, and the BBC never provided a detailed public explanation beyond vague references to the disturbing nature of the content. What is particularly interesting about Miri in retrospect is how restrained it actually is by modern standards. There is very little explicit violence. The horror is mostly psychological and conceptual. The idea of children aging in isolation for centuries, emotionally frozen while physically growing older, is unsettling in a way that does not require graphic imagery to land. The BBC's decision to restrict, it says less about what the episode showed and more about what it made audiences think and feel. If Miri disturbed censors because of what it implied, the second episode on this list disturbed them, or at least made them extremely nervous, because of what it showed plainly and without apology. Plato's Stepchildren is an episode from Season 3 of the original series, and it would be remembered today primarily as a somewhat strange installment involving telekinetic aliens who have modeled their society on ancient Greek philosophy. The plot involves the Enterprise visiting a community of beings called Platonians who possess extraordinary psychokinetic abilities. When their leader falls ill, he demands that Dr. McCoy stay behind permanently to serve as the community's physician. When Kirk and Spock refuse to allow this, the Platonians use their mental powers to torment the crew, forcing them to perform humiliating and painful acts against their will. And then comes the moment that changed television history. Under the control of the Platonians, Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura are forced toward each other. They kiss. It is brief. It is clearly not consensual in the context of the story, and it is framed as an act of humiliation imposed on both characters by their captors. But none of that context changed what American audiences and network executives understood they were witnessing. This was an interracial kiss between a white man and a black woman on primetime American television. In 1968, NBC was nervous before the episode aired, not because executives themselves objected to the scene, but because they were deeply worried about the reaction from affiliate stations in the American South, where racial integration was still a matter of violent political controversy. The network reportedly considered filming an alternate version of the scene without the kiss, but the cast refused. William Shatner and Nichelle Nichols have both spoken about their determination to ensure the moment aired exactly as written. The reaction, when the episode finally broadcast, was surprisingly measured. Some letters of complaint came in, but the feared avalanche of Southern outrage never materialized. Audiences, it turned out, were more prepared for progress than the network had assumed. The BBC, however, saw things differently. When Star Trek was eventually broadcast in the United Kingdom, Plato's Stepchildren was quietly left off the schedule entirely. The BBC's official reasoning was that the episode was too brutal. The scenes of Kirk and Spock being psychically tortured and forced to perform degrading acts were cited as the primary concern. Whether the interracial kiss was also a factor in the decision has been debated by historians and fans for decades, and the BBC never offered a fully transparent account of its reasoning. What is clear is that the episode was not aired, and that British audiences who wanted to see it had no official means of doing so for years. The irony of Plato's Stepchildren is that the kiss itself, the moment that caused all the anxiety, is one of the most celebrated scenes in the show's history. It has been cited as a landmark moment in the cultural history of American television, a small but genuinely significant act of representation at a time when such things carried enormous weight. Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura, later recounted that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. personally urged her to remain on the show because of what her presence on screen meant to Black Americans. He told her that Star Trek was one of the only programs he allowed his own children to watch. The third episode on this list is one that arrives at its disturbing power from a very different direction than the first two, where Miri unsettled audiences through horror and implication, and where Plato's stepchildren sparked controversy through a moment of social symbolism. Whom Gods Destroy gets under your skin by going somewhere that mainstream science fiction rarely dared to venture in the late 1960s, deep inside the psychology of madness. The setup of the episode is deceptively straightforward. The Enterprise is making a routine delivery of advanced medicine to Elba 2, a remote facility that houses the Federation's most dangerous, criminally insane patients. It is the kind of mission that, in the world of Star Trek, exists primarily to go catastrophically wrong, and this one does not disappoint. By the time Kirk and Spock arrive, the patients have seized control of the facility. The man responsible is Garth of Azar, a character whose backstory makes him one of the most genuinely tragic figures in the original series. Garth was once one of Starfleet's most celebrated captains, a legendary figure whose tactical brilliance inspired a generation of officers, including Kirk himself. His missions were studied at Starfleet Academy. He was by any measure a hero. Then something broke in him. The details are left deliberately vague, but the result is unmistakable. The man Kirk finds on Elba 2 is a raving megalomaniac who believes himself destined to rule the galaxy. He has somehow acquired the ability to physically shape-shift, taking on the appearance of anyone he chooses, which makes him extraordinarily dangerous in a facility full of people who are already difficult to control. He has also made himself the absolute ruler of his fellow inmates, maintaining control through fear and sudden, arbitrary cruelty. What makes Whom Gods Destroy so disturbing, and what eventually prompted the BBC to pull it from broadcast, is the specific texture of the horror it creates. This is not monster movie horror or action-adventure peril. The threat here is psychological and deeply human. Garth is intelligent, charming, and genuinely charismatic in moments, which makes his instability all the more frightening. He plays mind games with Kirk with the skill of someone who once understood exactly how Starfleet officers think. He kills one of the other inmates in a casual, offhand way simply to demonstrate that he can, not out of rage or strategy, but as a kind of performance of dominance. The climax of the episode involves Garth using his shape-shifting ability to impersonate Kirk, leaving Spock in the impossible position of having to determine which of the two identical men in front of him is actually his captain. It is a tense and clever resolution, but the episode's lasting impact comes not from that final confrontation, but from everything that leads up to it. The sense that the Federation's own celebrated history contains within it the seeds of this kind of collapse, that the line between hero and monster is not as solid as Starfleet's proud tradition suggests. The BBC determined that the episode's sustained portrayal of psychological torment, combined with the arbitrary violence and the deeply uncomfortable setting of a mental health facility, made it unsuitable for family broadcasting. The mix of madness, sadism, and what the network described as an unpleasant atmosphere of instability pushed it beyond the boundaries they were comfortable with. British audiences were kept from seeing it, and while it has since become available and is now recognized as one of the more thoughtful explorations of mental instability in the original series, its initial reception in the UK remains simply banned. Looking at these three episodes together,